Sure. My name is Laura Doering, and I'm an associate professor of strategic management and sociology at the University of Toronto. I became interested in interactions and social psychological processes actually in the work that I did prior to my academic research. I spent a short time working in international development. And when I was working in that field, I noticed how important interactions and relationships are to the outcomes of the development programs. And this was something that wasn't really taken into consideration in designing programs. And so there were often very surprising outcomes associated with the programs that were really driven by interactions among participants who people happened to be sitting next to and the relationships that they were building with one another. So when I started graduate school at the University of Chicago, I took this interest in interactions as kind of a secret, unexplored mechanism driving these large-scale economic and organizational processes with me. And I have carried that with me to today, whether I'm studying markets and organizations in development contexts or in North America. So I'll tell you two areas that I find most promising and underexplored. One that I am currently exploring and one that I am not exploring, but that I think definitely warrants exploration. So the topic that I am exploring relates to the sort of architecture of interactions that characterize any organization or market. I think that in organizational theory, in organizational sociology, economic sociology, when we think about the allocation of rewards that comes through engaging with organizations and markets, we often think either at a sort of institutional, cultural norm level, or we think at the level of individual or group level demographic characteristics. And I think interactions are kind of a missing middle between these two levels of analysis. And I think if we can see essentially the architecture of interactions that characterize these spaces, I think we'll be better able to understand who gets what and why in organizations and markets. And so I'm working on a book right now called Touch Points, and it describes touch points as repeating interactions through which individuals gain access to valued resources in organizations and markets. So that's an area that I, for a long time, had felt was really important and unexplored, and I'm finally working on a book to explore that. The second area that I think is really important that I am not working on, but that I think absolutely warrants exploration is the interface between digital and in-person interactions in organizations and markets. So much of our organizational and economic selves now are digitally co-present rather than physically in-person co-present. And I think understanding the way that digital co-presence exists alongside in-person co-presence is, I think, a really exciting and underexplored area. Classic theories of interaction really assume that people are physically co-present. And so I think this integration and this rise of digital interactions, I think there's a lot to explore there. So the research project that I'm presenting today looks at the relationship between rejection, feedback, gender, and whether or not one persists following rejection. So there's some research that suggests that women are less likely than men to persist in the face of rejection. And in this paper, what we're proposing is that may not be the entire story. We think that the feedback that people receive upon experiencing a rejection may pattern those gendered responses to a rejection. So we look at data from a context that many academics are familiar with. So this is an academic grant competition, sort of like the National Science Foundation but it's an institution that makes grants exclusively in the social sciences in Canada. And we look at the set of researchers who apply for a grant and are rejected. What's interesting about this competition, and is similar to many competitions, is that upon receiving a rejection, applicants also get feedback about how they performed relative to others. And in a lot of settings, people do receive feedback about their rejections. You can think about when you submit a paper for publication, you get a lot of feedback about why it was rejected. Similarly, when an Olympic athlete fails to medal in the Olympics, they can see how far they were from actually medaling. So people often do receive feedback about how close they came to experiencing success. And this is the case for these academics who receive their grant rejection feedback as well. So they know, if the funding cutoff bar was here, were they really, really close, or were they pretty far from the bar? And what we find is that when applicants were, here's the cutoff, when applicants were really close to the cutoff, men and women behave very similarly. We don't see gender differences in the likelihood of reapplying after experiencing a rejection. But among applicants who are kind of down here, like quite far from the cutoff, that's where we see a large gender disparity. That's where we see men being more likely to reapply and women being less likely to reapply. And then with that quantitative data, we then went on to do interviews with academics who had been rejected from this grant competition. And we tried to understand some of the mechanisms underlying, what was driving this difference. And we found that it related to cultures, sort of how comfortable people were talking about rejection, the size of the networks that they were communicating with, the depth of feedback that they were receiving, and then ultimately leading men to see that resubmitting the application was not so onerous, and women seeing resubmission as being quite a heavy lift. And then based on that data, we went back to the quant data and said, okay, if these mechanisms are broadly generalizable, we should see that women are making more changes to their applications and that they're more likely to succeed because they're putting more effort into the reapplication. And indeed, that is what we find, that women make more subsequent changes and that they experience more success after having been rejected. I do. So all advice tends to be autobiographical, and this is no exception. I have two pieces of advice for graduate students. So the first is to expose yourself as much as possible to works in progress. Often, the academic work that we're exposed to is in its published form. It's been spit shined and polished, and it just sparkles like a gem. But the fact is that even really accomplished and advanced scholars, their first drafts are pretty messy. And I think for graduate students, it's important to see that these really are works in progress, and also that there's a community of feedback that one gets in order to bring a paper to that level of polish and shine. And so to the extent that you can engage with scholars as they come for seminars or in other ways at conferences, to really see scholarship as mostly a work in progress rather than just a final product, I think is really important for your own scholarly development. And then the second piece of advice is to develop your admiration muscles. So as a graduate student, the kind of training that we get is to become more critical. And this is an important skill. It's an important muscle to build. We want to be skeptical scientists. We want to be able to point out what is flawed about existing work so that we can then improve upon it. So that is an important skill. But I think an equally important skill that is often underdeveloped is being able to look at others' work and say, wow, that's great. I really want to do something like that. This is, for whatever reason, be it the methods, the setting, the theory, to be able to look at a paper or a body of work and to have something that you are striving for rather than pushing yourself away from, I think is really important. I find I still do this. I read pretty widely in my field, and I often just find myself so inspired by work that I think is really, really excellent. And it still pushes me now to try to do better work. So I think we want to develop these complementary skills of being extremely critical and skeptical, but also being quick to admire and to identify the works that we would like to emulate. Okay, this was great. Thank you for having me.